The ghost of Marcus spoke to him in the scream of the November wind. It was a language Elias Thorne understood better than the quiet sympathy of civilians or the clinical jargon of therapists. The wind, like his guilt, was relentless. It tore at the loose siding of the derelict farmhouse, a sound like fingernails scraping down the length of a coffin. His coffin. This place was a graveyard of failures, his father's, who had lost the farm to the bank and then his life to the bottle. And now his own. The bank owned the land, but they hadn't bothered to evict the ghost haunting its skeletal remains. Elias was cheaper than a demolition crew. He sat at the warped kitchen table, a bottle of cheap whiskey his only companion. The scars on his hands, a pale web of raised tissue from a fire he couldn't remember, tightened in the cold. Outside, the Montana sky was the color of a fresh bruise, spitting a miserable, freezing rain. Each drop that hit the tin roof sounded like a distant sniper rifle, a phantom echo from the bone-dry hills of Kandahar. That was where he'd died. The man he was, Senior Chief Elias Thorne, Navy SEAL, was a name on a list of casualties. The IED that had vaporized his team, his brothers, had left his body mostly intact but had scooped out his soul, leaving a hollow shell that walked and breathed and drank. They'd given him a medal for the scars and a medical discharge for the nightmares. A fair trade, the bureaucracy seemed to think. He lifted the bottle, the amber liquid catching the bleak light. To the fallen, he rasped, the words scratching his throat. It was the same toast every night, for Marcus, for Dave, for Chen. For Ares, Marcus's K9 partner, a magnificent German shepherd who had been little more than a red mist by the time the dust settled. Elias had been the point man, the one who should have seen it, the one who survived. Survivor's guilt was a lazy term for it. This was a haunting, a damnation. The house groaned around him, a symphony of decay. The smell of rot and damp earth was thick in the air, a constant reminder of the end of things. He was just another part of the decay, crumbling into dust one drink at a time. This was his penance, to fade away in the place where his life had begun, surrounded by the ghosts of his family and the fresh, screaming specters of his team. He closed his eyes, welcoming the familiar spiral into oblivion, the only peace he ever found. But tonight, something cut through the static of his despair. It was a sound, thin and sharp, that didn't belong to the wind or the dying house. A whimper, high-pitched and desperate. It snagged on the edge of his consciousness, a fishhook in the murky water of his stupor. He told himself it was an animal, a coyote, something dying out in the dark where it belonged. He took another swig of whiskey, trying to drown it. The whimper came again, closer this time, followed by a low, guttural growl of pain. It wasn't the sound of a predator. It was the sound of a victim. Something inside him, a deeply buried instinct he thought long dead, stirred. The part of him that ran toward the sound of suffering, not away from it. Cursing, he pushed the chair back, the legs screeching in protest against the grimy linoleum. He grabbed the heavy mag light from the counter, its metal body cold and solid in his hand, and pulled on the worn leather jacket that hung by the door. The freezing rain hit him like a spray of shattered glass. It plastered his hair to his skull and soaked through his jeans in seconds. He swept the beam of the flashlight across the muddy track that served as his driveway, the light cutting a stark white tunnel through the oppressive dark. The whimpering was clearer now, coming from the ditch that ran alongside the county road, just beyond the rusted barbed wire fence that marked his property line. He moved with a fluid economy of motion that belied the alcohol in his system. The muscle memory of 1,000 nighttime patrols had survived the blast, even if the man had not. He vaulted the fence, his boots sinking into the sodden earth. He followed the sound, his light dancing over the weeds and trash that choked the ditch. And then the beam found it. It was a German shepherd, crumpled in the mud like a discarded coat. Its fur was matted with filth and blood. One of its hind legs was bent at an unnatural angle, the bone clearly shattered. Its ribs stood out in stark relief, a xylophone of starvation. It tried to lift its head as the light hit it, a low growl rumbling in its chest, but the effort was too much. Its head fell back into the mud with a soft thud. Elias knelt, the cold water seeping through the knees of his pants. He kept the main beam of the light off the dog's face, using the softer corona to see. It was dying. Someone had left it here to die. A flicker of movement down the road caught his eye. The red taillights of a vehicle disappearing over the rise. A white van, maybe. County markings. It was gone before he could be sure. A routine drop-off, a problem erased. He turned his attention back to the dog. He could see the tremor that racked its thin frame, a combination of cold, pain, and terror. Its breathing was shallow, ragged. But it was the eyes that stopped him cold. In the faint light, they were wide and dark, pools of liquid agony. And in their depths, Elias saw a reflection of himself. He saw the same haunted emptiness, the same brokenness, the same weary resignation to a cruel fate. This creature knew about ghosts. It was being haunted too. The dog was a mirror, a soul staring back at its own shattered reflection. For the first time in 3 years, Elias felt something other than the dull ache of grief or the burn of cheap whiskey. It was a spark, a hot, bright flash of pure, righteous anger. An anger so fierce, it momentarily burned away the fog in his mind. He wasn't a seal anymore. He was a ghost. But even ghosts could fight. "Easy, boy," he heard himself say, his voice a low, gravelly thing he barely recognized. "Easy now. I got you." He was halfway back to the barn, the dog a dead weight in his arms, when headlights sliced through the rain, pinning him in their glare. A white county animal control van crunched to a stop on the gravel shoulder. The driver's side door opened and a large, slovenly man in a dirty uniform climbed out, leaving the engine running. He had a face like a clenched fist and a gut that strained the buttons of his shirt. "The hell you think you're doing?" The man bellowed over the engine's rumble. His name tag read, "Dawkins." Elias didn't stop. He kept walking toward the barn, the dog cradled against his chest. It was surprisingly light, a fragile collection of bones wrapped in fur. "That's county property, asshole," Dawkins shouted, starting after him. "Put it down." Elias stopped and slowly turned. He let the man get closer, close enough to see the cold, flat emptiness in his eyes. He didn't say a word. He just stood there in the freezing rain, a scarred and broken man holding a scarred and broken dog, and let the silence stretch. The wind howled, a fitting soundtrack to the confrontation. Dawkins slowed, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his brutish features. He was used to dealing with crying suburbanites or belligerent drunks. He wasn't used to this. This was something different, something dangerous. He was looking at a predator. "Look, it's a stray," Dawkins said, his tone shifting from aggressive to defensive. "Aggressive. Sick. We got a call. It's scheduled for euthanasia. I'm just saving the county the paperwork. It's cheaper this way." The words hung in the air, obscene in their casual cruelty. Cheaper this way. The same logic that wrote off soldiers as acceptable losses and filed their deaths under budgetary constraints. "This dog is on my property now," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. It was the voice he had used to send men into the fire, the voice that brooked no argument. "Which makes him my property." "You don't want him," Dawkins scoffed, trying to regain his footing. "He's busted up. Gonna cost you a fortune at the vet if he even lives." "That's my problem," Elias said, his gaze unwavering. "Not yours. Get in your truck and get off my land." It wasn't a request. Dawkins saw it then. The man standing before him wasn't just some rural recluse. He saw the set of his jaw, the coiled stillness in his posture, the way he held the wounded animal with a fierce, protective tenderness. He saw the scars on his hands and the old, violent death that lived in his eyes. Dawkins, a bully at heart, knew when he was outmatched. Cowardice was a more powerful instinct than pride. He muttered something under his breath, a pathetic attempt to save face, and backed away. He clambered into his van, slammed the door, and spun his tires in the mud as he sped off into the night, leaving only the scent of exhaust and moral decay. Elias watched him go before turning his attention back to the animal in his arms. The dog had been watching the exchange, its head resting on Elias's forearm. It hadn't made a sound. He carried it the rest of the way to the barn, the only structure on the property that was reasonably dry. He laid the dog down gently on a pile of old horse blankets in an empty stall, the air thick with the smell of hay and dust. He filled a rusty bucket with water from the pump and brought it over. The dog watched his every move, its body tense with suspicion, but too weak to flee. Elias sat on the ground a few feet away, making himself small, non-threatening. He remembered Marcus and Aries. He remembered the quiet language of trust that passed between a man and his dog. Settle, he whispered, the command word Marcus had always used. Settle, soldier. The dog's ears twitched, a flicker of recognition in its pain-filled eyes. It let out a soft whine, a sound of profound misery, and laid its head down on the blanket. Elias sat with him in the dark, the silence of the barn a welcome respite from the screaming wind. He knew this was just the first step. The dog needed a doctor, not a ghost. And for reasons he couldn't yet articulate, he knew he would not let this soldier die alone in the dark. The drive to town was a blur of rain-slicked asphalt and the low, pained whimpers from the passenger seat. Elias had wrapped the dog in every blanket he could find, creating a makeshift nest on the worn seat of his beat-up Ford pickup. Every pothole sent a fresh tremor of pain through the animal's body, and a corresponding pang of something sharp and unfamiliar through Elias's chest. Empathy. It felt like a foreign organ being transplanted into his hollow core. He bypassed the larger, newer veterinary hospital on the edge of town and headed for the old district, where a small, unassuming clinic was tucked between a laundromat and a bail bonds office. Thorne Veterinary Services. The name was a coincidence, but he took it as a sign. A sign of what? He didn't know. The clinic's lights were on, a warm yellow beacon in the pre-dawn gloom. He carried the dog inside, the bell over the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful, inappropriate jingle. The place smelled of antiseptic, animal fur, and something vaguely like coffee. It was clean, orderly, a world away from the chaos of his farm. A woman looked up from behind the counter. She was maybe in her late 30s, with tired, intelligent eyes and dark hair pulled back in a messy bun. Her scrubs were faded, her expression wary. "We're not open for another hour," she said, her voice professional but firm. "He can't wait an hour," Elias said, his own voice sounding rougher than he intended. Her eyes dropped to the bundle of blankets in his arms, to the blood-matted fur and the still, suffering form of the dog. The wariness in her expression softened, replaced by a focused concern. "Bring him back," she said, nodding toward an examination room. On the table. She was Dr. Eris Thorne. The name on the sign wasn't a coincidence of family, just of life's random lottery. She worked with a quiet, efficient grace, her hands gentle but sure as she began her assessment. Elias stood back, feeling useless and out of place in the sterile, brightly lit room. "What happened?" she asked, not looking up from her work. Her fingers probed the shattered leg, her touch impossibly light. "Found him in a ditch. Animal control left him for dead." She paused, her jaw tightening. "Dawkins," she said, the name a curse. "This has his brand of calculated cruelty all over it. Malnourished, dehydrated, multiple old fractures that healed poorly. This leg is a fresh break, a bad one. Looks like he was hit by a car, or maybe just kicked with a steel-toed boot." She looked at Elias then, really looked at him, taking in the scars, the haunted eyes, the tension in his shoulders that spoke of a body constantly braced for impact. "You're the guy who bought the old Miller farm, aren't you?" Elias just nodded. "I'll need to sedate him to set this. It's going to be complicated," she said, preparing a syringe. As she worked, she carefully trimmed away some of the matted fur around the dog's ear to clean a superficial cut. She stopped, her hands going still. "Well, that's interesting." "What is it?" Elias asked, moving closer. She dabbed the area with an alcohol wipe, revealing a small faded tattoo on the inner flap of the dog's ear. It was a series of letters and numbers, precise and military in their application. K9-077. The air left Elias's lungs in a sudden sharp gasp. The room tilted. K9-077. He saw it as clearly as if it were branded on his own skin. Aries, Marcus's partner, the dog who had died in the blast, had been K9-076. They had been litter mates, trained together from birth. This wasn't just a German shepherd. This was a brother to the dog that had died with his team. What does that mean? Eris asked, seeing the profound shock on his face. It's a military designation, Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. He's a working dog, or he was. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers hovering just above the dog's head, not quite daring to touch, as if the animal were an apparition that might vanish. There's more, Eris said, her own voice hushed. She ran a handheld scanner over the dog's shoulder blades. It beeped. He's chipped. But she frowned at the screen. The code is encrypted, military grade by the looks of it. My system can't even begin to crack it. It's just a string of alphanumeric gibberish. Elias stared at the unconscious animal on the table, his mind racing, connecting dots he hadn't even known existed. A military working dog, a brother to Ares, dumped in a ditch miles from any base, with an encrypted chip and a story of abuse written into his very bones. This was wrong, all of it. He knew there was only one person he could call, one man who might have answers, who operated in the shadowy world where dogs like this were born and trained. He stepped outside into the cold, wet morning, the bell jingling his departure. He pulled out his phone, the screen slick with rain. He scrolled through the contacts, past names of men who were now just memories until he found the one he was looking for, Commander Vale, his former CO, a man who had seen Elias through his darkest days before the discharge papers came through. Vale answered on the second ring, his voice as crisp and clear as it had been in a command tent a world away. Thorn, it's been a while. Sir, Elias said, the word feeling strange and familiar on his tongue. I have a situation. He explained it all, his voice low and urgent. The dog, the condition, the tattoo. He could hear Vale typing on a keyboard as he spoke. K9-077, Vale repeated. Stand by, Eli. The line went quiet for a long minute. Elias could hear the distant murmur of an office, the life he had left behind. He watched Eris through the clinic window as she worked on the dog. A silent, focused ballet of healing. Vale came back on the line, and the tone of his voice had changed. The professional calm was gone, replaced by something hard and cold. Eli, where are you? A vet clinic, a town called Prairie Creek. Listen to me very carefully, Vale said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The dog's name is Kaiser. He was assigned to a DARPA research unit, Advanced Genetics, Enhanced Sensory Program. He was officially declared killed in action 18 months ago. Elias's blood ran cold. Sir, that's not possible. The op that killed my team was 18 months ago. I know, Vale said, his voice grim. According to the after-action report, Kaiser was lost in the same IED blast that took Marcus and Ares. His body was never recovered. Eli, if that dog is alive, it means the official report is a lie, and the people who wrote that lie will do anything to keep it from coming out. That encrypted chip just pinged a server at the Pentagon the second your vet's scanner touched it. They know where you are. A cold dread, more primal than any fear he'd felt in combat, settled in Elias's gut. What do I do, sir? Stay put. Lock the doors. I'm spinning up a QRF, but I'm hours out. You need to understand, Thorn. You're not holding a stray dog. You're holding a multi-million-dollar government secret, and the people who stole him are not going to let him go. The line went dead. Elias stood in the rain, the commander's words echoing in his head. The war he thought he had left behind in the dust of Afghanistan had just followed him home. And it was standing in a small vet clinic in the middle of nowhere, sleeping peacefully on an examination table. He went back inside, the bell sounding like an alarm. Oris looked up, a question in her eyes. We have a problem, Elias said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He walked over to the front door and flipped the deadbolt. A big one. The quiet hum of the clinic's fluorescent lights seemed unnaturally loud in the ensuing silence. Eris finished bandaging Kaiser's leg, her movements now laced with a new tension. She looked from the locked door to the sleeping dog, then to the hard, focused expression on Elias's face. He was no longer the broken man who had stumbled in an hour ago. He was a soldier, a sentinel. What kind of problem? She asked, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her heart. The kind that doesn't knock, Elias replied, his eyes scanning the street outside the clinic's large front window. The sleepy town of Prairie Creek was slowly coming to life, but Elias wasn't looking at the bakery truck making its morning delivery. He was looking at the shadows, the alleyways, the reflections in the shop windows across the street. He was assessing firing lanes and fields of view, his mind a cold, calculating machine. He turned to Eris. Is there a back way out of here? An alley door. It leads to the parking area. Barricade it. Use the heavy kennels, anything you've got. Turn off the lights in the front. Keep this room lit. We stay here. He moved toward the back, to a small supply room. Do you have any rubbing alcohol? Bleach? Anything in a pressurized can? What are you doing? She asked, her voice trembling slightly as she began to understand the gravity of the situation. Improvising, he said, his hands already gathering supplies. He was a warrior preparing his battlefield. The clinic was no longer a place of healing. It was a fortress, a last stand. Night fell like a shroud over the small town. Every passing car sent a jolt of adrenaline through Elias's system. He had moved Kaiser off the metal table and onto a soft bed on the floor in the corner of the room, as far from the windows and doors as possible. The dog was still groggy from the anesthesia, but his eyes were open, tracking Elias's every move with a quiet, intelligent intensity. Eris sat on a stool, her arms wrapped around herself. She had done as he asked, her fear warring with a stubborn refusal to abandon him or the animal she had sworn to protect. She had seen violence on her table before, abused animals, tragic accidents, but this was different. This was a deliberate, human darkness descending upon them. The first sign of their arrival was subtle. The streetlights in the alley behind the clinic suddenly went out. Not a flicker, but a sudden, decisive plunge into blackness. Elias, who had been watching the alley through a small window in the back door, didn't flinch. They're here, he said, his voice a low whisper. Stay with the dog. Stay down. He moved away from the door, melting into the shadows of the hallway. He held a heavy steel fire extinguisher in his hands, its weight familiar and reassuring. He was unarmed, but he was not defenseless. His body was a weapon, and his mind was a map of deadly intentions. A metallic scrape came from the back door, the sound of a pry bar forcing its way into the door jamb. The wood splintered, the lock gave way with a sharp crack. The door swung inward, revealing two figures silhouetted against the deeper darkness of the alley. They were dressed in black tactical gear, moving with the quiet efficiency of professionals. They were not common thugs, they were hunters. The first man stepped inside, a suppressed pistol held at the ready. He swept the room, his movements economical and precise. His partner followed, covering the opposite angle. They never saw Elias. He moved from the side, a ghost in the shadows. He brought the fire extinguisher down in a brutal, silent arc, striking the second man at the base of the skull. The man crumpled without a sound, a puppet with its strings cut. The first man spun around, reacting to the sound of the body hitting the floor. He was fast, but Elias was faster. He discharged the fire extinguisher directly into the man's face, the cloud of CO2 and chemical powder blinding him, choking him. The man gasped, clawing at his face, his pistol firing wildly into the ceiling. Plaster rained down. Elias closed the distance in a single step. He drove his elbow into the man's throat, collapsing his windpipe. He took the pistol from the man's limp hand as he fell, the weapon's weight settling into his palm like a long-lost friend. He checked the magazine. Full. He stood over the two downed men, his breathing even, his heart a steady, cold drum. The numbness was gone, replaced by an icy, hyper-focus calm. This, he knew, this was his language. But he knew this was just the probe. The main assault would come from the front. He ran back to the examination room just as the front window of the clinic exploded inward, showering the reception area with glass. Two more figures in black rolled through the opening, guns up, fanning out to clear the room. Contact front, Elias yelled to Eris, more out of instinct than necessity. He dropped to one knee behind the sturdy reception counter, using it for cover. He raised the captured pistol and fired two precise shots. Double tap, center mass. The first man went down, a surprised grunt escaping his lips. The second man returned fire. a volley of suppressed rounds thudding into the drywall and shredding the pamphlets on the counter. Elias felt a searing pain in his left shoulder as a round tore through the muscle. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the hot flood of blood soaking his shirt. In the corner, Kaiser struggled to his feet. Despite his freshly set leg, despite the drugs still in his system, he stood. A low, savage growl, the sound of a gathering storm, rumbled deep in his chest. He was a soldier, and his commander was under fire. The remaining mercenary advanced, stepping over his fallen comrade, his weapon trained on Elias's position. He was methodical, confident, ready to end it. He never saw the dog. Kaiser launched himself across the room, a blur of black and tan fury. He moved with a speed and ferocity that defied his injuries. He hit the mercenary in the chest with the force of a battering ram, knocking him off his feet. His jaws, bred and trained for this exact purpose, locked onto the man's gun arm. The man screamed, a high, piercing sound of agony and surprise. His pistol clattered to the floor. The distraction was all Elias needed. He rose from behind the counter, the world narrowing to the space between his front sight and the target. He fired once. The fight was over. Silence descended on the ruined clinic, broken only by the ragged sound of his own breathing and Kaiser's low growls. Blood dripped from his shoulder onto the linoleum floor, each drop a punctuation mark in the sudden, violent stillness. Aris slowly emerged from behind the examination table, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. She looked at the bodies, at Elias standing like a statue of vengeance, and at the wounded dog standing guard over him. "It's over," Elias said, the words feeling hollow. He knew it wasn't. This was just the beginning. They would send more. As if on cue, the sound of sirens began to cut through the night. Faint at first, then growing steadily louder. Red and blue lights flashed against the shattered front window, painting the scene of carnage in strobing, surreal colors. Elias lowered the pistol, the adrenaline beginning to ebb, leaving behind a deep, throbbing pain in his shoulder and a profound weariness. He looked at Kaiser, who had limped back to his side, nudging his hand with his nose. The dog looked up at him, and in that moment, Elias understood. They were the same, survivors of the same war, betrayed by the same people. Two broken soldiers standing together in the ruins. The cavalry had arrived. Not local cops, but a fleet of black SUVs that swarmed the street, disgorging a dozen men in federal tactical gear. They moved with the same professional efficiency as the men lying dead in the clinic, but their patches read FBI. They secured the perimeter, their voices clipped and urgent on their radios. Commander Vale stepped out of the lead vehicle. He wasn't in uniform, but in a tailored suit that did little to hide the rigid military posture beneath. He strode into the clinic, his eyes taking in the scene, the bodies, the shattered glass, the blood, with a grim, practiced assessment. His gaze landed on Elias, who was now sitting on the floor, his back against the counter, while Eris frantically worked to staunch the bleeding in his shoulder. "Took you long enough, sir," Elias said, his voice strained. "Traffic was hell," Vale replied, a flicker of a smile touching his lips before vanishing. He knelt beside Elias, his eyes full of a deep paternal concern. "The medics are right behind me. How you holding up, son?" "Peachy," Elias grunted as Eris tightened a pressure bandage. Vale looked over at Kaiser, who sat faithfully by Elias's side, a silent, watchful guardian. The dog met his gaze without fear, a soldier recognizing a commanding officer. "So that's him," Vale said, his voice soft with something akin to reverence. "Kaiser, the ghost." Paramedics swarmed in, and the next hour was a controlled chaos of medical assessments, hushed conversations, and the quiet, grim work of the body bags. Elias refused to be taken to a hospital until he knew Kaiser and Eris were safe. Vale assured him they would be under federal protection. Later, as the dawn broke, painting the bruised sky in hues of orange and purple, Vale sat with Elias in the back of an ambulance. The commander held 2 steaming cups of coffee, handing one to Elias. "You need to know the whole story," Vale said, his voice heavy. "It's not just about a stolen dog." He began to talk, and the final ugly pieces of the puzzle slotted into place. The men who had attacked the clinic were mercenaries, ex-special forces working for a private military contractor named Lynch. Lynch's company had been subcontracted by DARPA to assist in the advanced MWD program. Lynch saw the dollar signs, Vale explained, his eyes hard. These dogs weren't just soldiers, they were genetic gold mines. He started a side business, selling their DNA and eventually the dogs themselves to foreign powers. He needed a way to get them off the books. He listed them as KIA, Elias whispered, the horrifying truth dawning on him. Vale nodded grimly. He needed plausible deniability. An active war zone was the perfect cover. The IED that killed your team, Eli. It wasn't planted by the Taliban. Elias stared at him, his mind refusing to process the words. Lynch's men planted it, Vale said, his voice laced with cold fury. They targeted your patrol specifically. In the chaos of the blast, while everyone was scrambling, they snatched Kaiser. Marcus, Ares, the rest of your team. They weren't casualties of war. They were murdered to cover up the theft of a dog. The world dissolved into a roaring white noise in Elias's ears. The ghost of Marcus, the one he had carried for 3 years, the one that whispered accusations of his failure in the dead of night, suddenly changed. The survivor's guilt that had been his constant companion, the anchor that held him to his grief, was ripped away, replaced by a grief so pure and so profound it stole his breath. They hadn't died because he had failed. They had been executed. He felt a hand on his arm and looked up to see Vale watching him, his expression one of deep sympathy. Lynch faked the report. He was a hero's hero, consoling the families while selling the asset that got their sons killed. Dawkins, the animal control flunky, was just a low-level contact. The deal for Kaiser must have gone south, so Lynch paid him a few $100 to make the dog disappear permanently. Tears streamed down Elias's face, hot and silent. They weren't tears of self-pity, but of mourning. For the first time, he was truly mourning his friends, not his own perceived failure. He was grieving their stolen lives, the honor of their sacrifice that had been so cruelly tarnished. He felt a wet nose press against his hand. He looked down into Kaiser's deep, intelligent eyes. This dog was not a reminder of his greatest failure. He was the last witness, the living proof of his team's honor. He was the mission they had died for, without ever knowing it. In that moment, looking at the animal who had survived betrayal, abuse, and abandonment, Elias finally forgave himself. The ghosts didn't vanish, but their screams subsided into whispers. They were no longer his accusers. They were his brothers, waiting for justice. Lynch? Elias asked, his voice thick with emotion. We picked him up an hour ago trying to board a private jet in Virginia, Vale said. He'll never see the light of day again. It's over, Eli. It's finally over. 6 months later, the sun was warm on Elias Thorne's face. The November wind was gone, replaced by a gentle June breeze that carried the scent of freshly cut hay and blooming wildflowers. He sat on the newly repaired porch of the farmhouse, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands. The peeling paint had been stripped away, replaced with a clean, bright coat of white. The broken windows were fixed, the yard was clear, and in the fields beyond, neat rows of alfalfa stretched toward the horizon. The graveyard had been resurrected. A heavy head rested on his knee. Kaiser, his coat now thick and glossy, his body strong and whole, looked up at him with an expression of unwavering devotion. The limp was almost gone, a faint memory of the night they had found each other in the mud and the rain. The courts, with a heavy push from Commander Vale and the Department of Defense, had officially retired Kaiser from service, placing him in the permanent custody of the man who had saved his life. The front door creaked open, and Eris stepped out, carrying another mug of coffee. She smiled, a real easy smile that made the corners of her eyes crinkle. She had sold her clinic in town, merging her practice with a larger hospital to give herself more freedom. A freedom she now spent, more often than not, at the old Miller farm. She sat in the rocking chair next to him, a comfortable silence settling between them. They were a strange, cobbled-together family, forged in violence and healed by patience. Vale called, she said, breaking the silence. He said the first of the memorial Memorial scholarships has been awarded. The Marcus Thorne Foundation. Elias nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He had used the compensation money the government had quietly given him to start a foundation in Marcus's name, providing scholarships for the children of fallen K-9 handlers. It was a way to build something that would last, a legacy of honor, not of grief. He looked out at the sprawling Montana landscape, at the life teeming in the fields and the sky. The ghosts were still there, but they were quiet now. They walked with him, not behind him. They were memories, not hauntings. Marcus, Dave, Chen, Aries. They were a part of him, the foundations upon which he was building this new life. Kaiser nudged his hand, whining softly. Elias chuckled, scratching the dog behind the ears. All right, I know. He stood up, placing his coffee mug on the railing, and picked up the worn tennis ball from the porch steps. He drew his arm back and threw the ball with all his might. It soared through the air, a bright yellow speck against the brilliant blue sky. Kaiser exploded off the porch, a symphony of joyful power and grace, his powerful legs eating up the ground as he chased after his prize. Elias watched him run, a genuine, unforced smile spreading across his face. He was no longer a ghost haunting a graveyard. He was a man, standing in the sun, on his own land, with his family beside him. He had a new mission now, one that didn't involve rifles or enemies or the dark corners of the world. His mission was to live, and as Kaiser returned, dropping the slobbery ball at his feet, ready for the next throw, Elias knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was no longer fighting alone.